Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. One of the central figures in Pickett's charge was the colonel responsible for the massive artillery bombardment intended to soften up Union positions prior to the assault. He's the man pictured here, Edward Porter Alexander, life dates 1835 to 1910. The Georgia native, known as Porter to friends and family, had graduated from West Point in 1857 and proved a capable and efficient young officer prior to the war, playing a part in the early experiments that led to the formation of the U.S. Signal Corps. Porter proved his mettle in combat as a Confederate at 1st Manassas, the Peninsula Campaign, 2nd Manassas, Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville along the way. His artillery placements helped lead the Army of Northern Virginia to victory. At Gettysburg, you students of the Civil War know that 28-year-old Porter gave the go-ahead to General James Longstreet to advance Pickett's division into the maelstrom of shot and shell that ended in a significant loss of life and the resounding defeat of Lee. In 1877, Porter replied to a request of Confederate officers for their views on several points about the failure of Gettysburg. The request was made by Prince Louis Philip Albert d'Orleans, the Count of Paris, who was working on a 4-volume history of the Civil War. That request was made to the secretary of the Southern Historical Society, Reverend John William Jones, life dates 1836 to 1909. It is no surprise that Porter would respond. His honest appraisal of the success and failure of the Confederates during the war are well known to historians. I want to share a portion of Porter's answer, the passage in which he describes his experience on July 3rd, 1863. Porter begins, "Before daylight on the morning of the 3rd, I received orders to post the artillery for an assault upon the enemy's position, and later I learned that it was to be led by Pickett's division and directed on Cemetery Hill. Some of the batteries had gone back for ammunition and forage, but they were all brought up immediately, and by daylight, all then on the field were posted. Deering's battalion, with Pickett's division, reported sometime during the morning. The enemy fired on our movements and positions occasionally, doing no great damage, and we scarcely returned a shot. The morning was consumed in waiting for Pickett's division and possibly other movements of infantry. While forming for the attack, I borrowed from General Pendleton, General Lee's chief of artillery, 7 12-pounder howitzers belonging to the 3rd Corps under Major Richardson, which I put in reserve in a selected spot, intending them to accompany Pickett's infantry and the charge to have the advantage of fresh horses and men and full chests of ammunition for the critical moments, in case the batteries engaged in the preliminary cannonade should be so cut up and exhausted as to be slow in getting up. About 11 a.m., the skirmishers in A.P. Hill's front got to fighting for a barn in between the lines, and the artillery on both sides gradually took part until the whole of Hill's artillery in position, which I think was 63 guns, were heavily engaged with about an equal number of the enemy's guns for over a half hour. But not one of the 75 guns which I then had in line was allowed to fire a shot, as we had at best but a short supply of ammunition for the work laid out. In this connection, note that the number of rounds which is carried with each piece in its limber and caisson is, including canister, about 130 to 150, about enough for 1 hour and a half of rapid firing. I am very sure that our ordnance trains did not carry into Pennsylvania a reserve supply of more than 100 rounds per gun additional, and I don't believe they had over 60 rounds to a gun. I've never seen the figures, but I myself, Chief of Ordnance of the Army from August 1861 to November 1862 and was very familiar with the extent and capacity of the ordnance trains. When nearer Richmond, we seldom had a reserve of over 50 rounds per gun, the difficulty of transportation always limiting us to the utmost economy in its use and in the trains devoted to its carriage. Gradually, the cannonade just referred to died out as it began, and the field became nearly silent. But writers have frequently referred to the cannonade preceding the assault as having begun at 11 o'clock and lasted for some hours, being misled by this affair. About 12 noon, General Longstreet told me that when Pickett was ready, he would himself give the signal for all our guns to open, which was to be two guns from the Washington artillery near the center of our line. And meanwhile, he desired me to select a suitable position for observation and to take with me one of General Pickett's staff and exercise my judgment in selecting the moment for Pickett's advance to begin. Complying, I selected the advance salient angle of the woods in which Pickett's line now formed, just on the left flank of my line of 75 guns. While occupying this position and in conversation with General A.R. Wright, commanding a Georgia brigade in A.P. Hill's corps, who had just come out there for an observation of the position, I received a note from General Longstreet, which I copy from the original still in my possession as follows. Headquarters, July 3rd, 1863. Colonel, if the artillery fire does not have the effect to drive off the enemy or greatly demoralize him so as to make our efforts pretty certain, I would prefer that you should not advise General Pickett to make the charge. I shall rely a great deal on your good judgment to determine the matter and shall expect you to let General Pickett know when the moment offers. Respectfully, J. Longstreet, Lieutenant General, to Colonel E.P. Alexander, Artillery. This note at once suggested that there was some alternative to the attack and placed on me the responsibility of deciding the question. I endeavored to avoid it by giving my views in a note of which I kept no copy, but of which I have always retained a vivid recollection, having discussed its points with General A.R. Wright as I wrote it. It was expressed very nearly as follows. General, I will only be able to judge of the effect of the fire on the enemy by his return fire, for his infantry is but little exposed to the view, and the smoke will obscure the whole field. If, as I infer from your note, there is any alternative to this attack, it should be carefully considered before opening our fire, for it will take all the artillery ammunition we have left to test this one thoroughly. And if the result is unfavorable, we will have none left for another effort. And even if this is entirely successful, it can only be so at a very bloody cost. Very respectfully, and etc., E.P. Alexander, Colonel Artillery. To this note, I received the following reply, the original still in my possession. Headquarters, July 3rd, 1863. Colonel, the intention is to advance the infantry if the artillery has the desired effect of driving the enemies off or having other effect such as to warrant us in making an attack. When the moment arrives, advise General P and, of course, advance such artillery as you can use in aiding the attack. Respectfully, J. Longstreet, Lieutenant General Commanding, to Colonel Alexander. This letter again placed the responsibility upon me, and I felt it very deeply, for the day was rapidly advancing. It was about 12 noon or a little later, and whatever was to be done soon. Meanwhile, I had been anxiously discussing the attack with General A.R. Wright, who said that the difficulty was not so much in reaching Cemetery Hill or taking it, that his brigade had carried it the afternoon before, but that the trouble was to hold it, for the whole Federal army was massed in a sort of horseshoe shape and could rapidly reinforce the point to any extent, while our long enveloping line could not give prompt enough support. This somewhat reassured me, as I had heard it said in the morning that General Lee had ordered every brigade in the army to charge Cemetery Hill, and it was at least certain that the question of supports had had his careful attention. Before answering, however, I rode back to converse with General Pickett, whose line was now formed or forming in the wood. And without telling him of the question I had to decide, I found out that he was entirely sanguine of success in the charge and was only congratulating himself on the opportunity. I was convinced that to make any halfway effort would ensure a failure of the campaign, and that if our artillery fire was once opened, after all the time consumed in preparation for the attack, the only hope of success was to follow it up promptly with one supreme effort, concentrating every energy we possessed into it. And my mind was fully made up that if the artillery opened, Pickett must charge. After the second note from General Longstreet, therefore, and the interview with Pickett, I did not feel justified in making any delay, but to acquaint General Longstreet with my determination. I wrote him a note, which I think I wrote verbatim as follows: General, when our artillery fire is doing its best, I shall advise General Pickett to advance. It was my intention, as he had a long distance to traverse, that he should start not later than 15 minutes after our fire opened. About this time, too, to be sure that Richardson with his 7 12-pounder howitzers should be promptly on hand, I sent for him to come up through the woods and be ready to move ahead of Pickett's division in the advance. To my great disappointment, I learned, just as we opened fire, and too late to replace him, that General Pendleton had sent 4 of his guns without my knowledge to some other part of the field, and the other 3 had also moved off and could not be found. Probably, however, the presence of guns in the head of this column would only have resulted in their loss, but it would have been a brilliant opportunity for them, and I always feel like apologizing for their absence. It was 1 p.m. by my watch when the signal guns were fired, the field at that time being entirely silent, but for light picket firing between the lines. And as suddenly as an organ strikes up in a church, the grand roar followed from all the guns of both sides. The enemy's fire was heavy and severe, and their accounts represent ours as having been equally so, though our rifle guns were comparatively few and had only very defective ammunition. As an illustration, I remember that the casualties in my own battalion, 26 guns, were about 147 men and 116 horses in the 2 days' action, and about 80% of the wounds were from artillery fire. General A.S. Webb, USA, who commanded a brigade on Cemetery Hill, told me after the war that a Federal battery coming into action on the hill lost from our artillery fire 27 out of 36 horses in about 10 minutes. Average distances, I should suppose, were about 1,400 yards. We had some casualties from canister. I'd fully intended giving Pickett the order to advance as soon as I saw that our guns had gotten their ranges, say in 10 or 15 minutes. But the enemy's fire was so severe that when the time had elapsed, I could not make up my mind to order the infantry out into a fire which I did not believe they could face for so long a charge in such a hot sun, tired as they already were by the march from Chambersburg. I accordingly waited in hopes that our fire would produce some visible effect or something turn up to make the situation more hopeful. But 15 minutes more passed without any change of the situation, the fire on neither side slackening for a moment. Even then, I could not bring myself to give a peremptory order to Pickett to advance, but feeling that this critical moment would soon pass, I wrote him a note to this effect: If you are coming at all, you must come immediately, or I cannot give you proper support. But the enemy's fire has not slackened materially, and at least 18 guns are still firing from the cemetery itself. This note, which, though given from memory, I can vouch for is very near verbatim. I sent off at 1:30 p.m., consulting my watch. I afterwards heard what followed its receipt from members of the staff of both Generals Pickett and Longstreet as follows. Pickett, on receiving it, galloped over to General Longstreet, who was not far off, and showed it to General L. The latter read it and made no reply. General Longstreet himself, speaking of it afterwards, said that he knew the charge had to be made, but could not bring himself to give the order. General Pickett then said, "General, shall I advance?" Longstreet turned around in his saddle and would not answer. Pickett immediately saluted and said, "I am going to lead my division forward, sir," and galloped off to put it in motion, on which General L left his staff and rode out alone to my position. Meanwhile, 5 minutes after I sent the above note to Pickett, the enemy's fire suddenly slackened materially, and the batteries in the cemetery were limbered up and withdrawn. As the enemy had such an abundance of ammunition and so much better guns than ours that they were not compelled to reserve their artillery for critical moments, as we almost always do, I knew that I must have felt the punishment a good deal, and I was a good deal elated by the sight. But to make sure that it was a withdrawal for good and not a mere change of position or relieving of the batteries by fresh ones, I waited for 5 minutes more, closely examining the ground with a large glass. At that time, I sent a courier to Pickett with a note, "For God's sake, come quick. The 18 guns are gone." And going to the nearest gun, I sent a lieutenant and a sergeant, one after the other, with other messages to the same effect. A few minutes after this, Pickett still not appearing, General Longstreet rode up alone, having seen Pickett and left his staff as above. I showed him the situation and said I only feared I could not give Pickett the help I wanted to, my ammunition being very low and the 7 guns under Richardson having taken off. General Longstreet spoke up promptly. "Go and stop Pickett right where he is and replenish your ammunition." I answered that the ordnance wagons had been nearly emptied, replacing expenditures of the day before, that not more than 20 rounds to each gun were left, too little to accomplish much, and that while this was being done, the enemy would recover from the effect of the fire we were now giving him. His reply was, "I don't want to make this charge. I don't believe it can succeed. I would stop Pickett now, but that General Lee has ordered it and expects it." And other remarks showing that he would have been easily induced, even then, to order Pickett to halt. It was just at this moment that Pickett's line appeared sweeping out of the wood, Garnett's brigade passing over us. I then left General Longstreet and rode a short distance with General Garnett, an old friend who had been sick but buttoned up his old blue overcoat in spite of the heat of the day, was riding in front of his line. I then galloped along my line of guns, ordering those that had over 20 rounds left to limber up and follow Pickett, and those that had less to maintain their fire from where they were. I'd advanced several batteries or parts of batteries in this way when General Pickett's division appeared on the slope of Cemetery Hill, and a considerable force of the enemy were thrown out, attacking his unprotected right flank. Meanwhile, too, several batteries which had been withdrawn were run out again and were firing on him very heavily. We opened on these troops and batteries with the best we had in the shop and appeared to do them considerable damage. But meanwhile, Pickett's division just seemed to melt away in the blue musketry smoke which now covered the hill. Nothing but stragglers came back. As soon as it was clear that Pickett was gone up, I ceased firing, saving what little ammunition was left for fear of an advance by the enemy. About this time, General Lee came up to our guns alone and remained there a half hour or more, speaking to Pickett's men as they came straggling back and encouraging them to form again in the first cover they could find. While he was here, Colonel Fremantle of the Coldstream Guards rode up, who afterwards wrote a very graphic account of the battle and incidents occurring here, which was published in Blackwood's magazine. A little before this, Heath's division under Pettigrew had been advanced also, but I cannot recall the moment or the place where I saw them, but only the impression on my mind as the men passed us that the charge must surely be some misapprehension of orders, as the circumstances at the moment were making it utterly impossible that it could accomplish anything. And I thought, what a pity it was that so many of them were about to be sacrificed in vain. It was intended, I believe, that Pettigrew should support Pickett's right flank, but the advance at distance had to be traversed, and the charge got such an interval between the two that Pickett's force was spent and his division disintegrated before Pettigrew's got under close fire. I have always believed that the enemy here lost the greatest opportunity they ever had of routing General Lee's army by prompt offensive. They occupied a line shaped somewhat like a horseshoe. I suppose that the greatest diameter of the horseshoe was not more than 1 mile, and the ground within was entirely sheltered from our observation and fire, with communications by signals all over it, and they could concentrate their whole force at any point in a very short while and without our knowledge. Our line was enveloping semicircle over 4 miles in development, and communication from flank to flank, even by courier, was difficult, the country being well cleared and exposed to the enemy's fire and view, the roads all running at right angles to our lines, and some of them at least broad turnpikes, which the enemy's gun could rake for 2 miles. It is necessary now to add any statement as to the superiority of the Federal force or the exhausted and shattered condition of the Confederates for a space of at least a mile in their very center, to show that a great opportunity was thrown away. I think that General Lee himself was quite apprehensive that the enemy would report, and that it was that apprehension that brought him alone out to my guns where he could observe all the indications. So there you have General Lee, you have General Longstreet, and Colonel Porter Alexander, his his recollection of the massive bombardment before the charge of Pickett's division on July 3rd, 1863. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.